At 18, Elara had already lost two families, the one she was born to and the one the state had made for her, a pale imitation held together with paperwork and routine. All the world left her was a thin manila envelope containing a birth certificate with a name she did not recognize and a rusted iron key to a condemned cannery on the forgotten end of the docks. The deed transferred for the official sum of $1 in paid-back taxes. The town council, she would later hear, had a good laugh about that. A girl with nothing, given a building worth less than nothing. But what nobody knew, what the salt-eaten boards and the shattered windows kept secret, was that behind the great walk-in freezer, a metal box sweating with the ghost of cold, sealed away from the sea and the rot and the slow grind of time, Silas had left the only thing that ever truly mattered. That, though, comes later. First, there was the leaving. The final morning at the state home was the color of dishwater. A pale, exhausted gray that promised nothing. She packed the few things she owned into a canvas bag. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a worn copy of a book with a faded cover, and a small, smooth stone she'd kept in her pocket since she was a child. A perfect gray oval that felt cool and solid in her palm. The head matron, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched from decades of budgets and disappointments, handed her the envelope without a word of warmth. Her duty done. The gate of the institution clicked shut behind Elara with a sound of profound finality. A sound that separated her past from a future that was a complete and terrifying void. The bus ride was 6 hours through flat, tired country that eventually buckled and rose into hills, then fell away to meet the sea. The air changed, growing heavy and wet, tasting of salt and something else, something like decay and endurance mixed together. She got off at a stop in a town that looked as if it had been left behind by the tide. The paint on the buildings was peeling in long strips, the wood of the storefronts was bleached to the color of bone, and a persistent, damp wind bullied loose scraps of paper down the empty main street. She felt the eyes of the town on her as she walked. The new thing, the girl with the canvas bag and the look of someone who had just been set down in a place she didn't belong. The town clerk, a man with a soft, round body and suspicious eyes, looked at the deed in her envelope and then back at her. He made a small, wet sound with his lips, a little puff of pity and dismissal. "Silas's old place," he said, not a question. "You his kin." Elara shook her head. "I don't know who he was." This seemed to confirm something for the clerk. He stamped a form with unnecessary force. "Well, it's yours now. What's left of it. The town will likely be taking it for the land by year's end. Condemnation orders already been drawn up. Just a matter of filing." He pushed the papers back to her. He didn't offer a map. He didn't offer a welcome. He just pointed a thick finger toward the window. "Down at the end of the wharf. You can't miss it. It's the one that's falling down." She walked toward the water. The cry of the gulls growing louder, more insistent. A raw and lonely sound that seemed to be coming from inside her own chest. The wharf was a spine of rotting piers stretching out into a gray harbor. And there it was. It wasn't just falling down. It looked like a great wooden beast that had laid down to die on the shore, its bones showing through its skin, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the indifferent sea. It was bigger than she had imagined. A sprawling carcass of rust and ruin. This was her inheritance. This was all she had. A place the world had already thrown away. She stood there for a long time, the wind pulling at her hair, the single iron key growing heavy and cold in her hand. She found a diner a block from the wharf, a long, narrow room that smelled of coffee and fried onions and something warm and old, like baked bread and settled dust. The sign in the window just said, "Eat," in faded red letters. A woman with a cloud of white hair pinned up on her head and hands that were chapped and strong from work wiped down the counter as Elara slid onto a stool. The woman's eyes, a pale, clear blue, missed nothing. "You're the girl," she said. It wasn't a question. The one for Silas's place. Elara just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The woman placed a thick ceramic mug in front of her and filled it with steaming black coffee without asking. "I'm Martha," she said. "Drink that. You look like you've been chilled to the bone." The coffee was hot and bitter and good. It spread a small, fragile warmth through her chest. "They said at the clerk's office. They said it's condemned." Martha snorted, a sound like gravel turning over. That clerk's been saying that for 10 years. He's got the patience of a vulture, just waiting for the thing to fall so his brother-in-law can get the land cheap. She leaned on the counter, her expression softening just a little. You knew him? Silas? Alara asked, her voice quiet. Knew him my whole life, Martha said, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the sea. He wasn't what people thought. Not at the end. She began to talk, her voice low and steady, a rhythm that was part of the diner's quiet hum. She told Alara how Silas's family had run the cannery for 3 generations, how the whole town had once worked to the sound of its steam whistle. She described the smell of the brine, the flash of silver scales, the shouts of the fishermen on the docks. Silas, she said, had hands that could fix any engine and a mind that understood the tides better than the moon did. But the world changed. Big factory ships came, massive operations that scooped the life from the sea and processed it miles offshore. The small boats couldn't compete. The town's fishing fleet dwindled, then vanished. The cannery slowed, sputtered, and one day the whistle just didn't blow. He tried to keep it going, Martha said, her voice dropping lower. Tried other things, canning vegetables from the inland farms, making preserves. But the big companies had the market cornered. Squeezed him from every side. Silas grew quiet, reclusive. The town saw him as a failure, a stubborn old man clinging to a corpse. He let the building go, the paint peel, the windows break. He became a ghost haunting his own failure. But he wasn't just sitting there, Martha said, her eyes coming back to Alara, sharp and focused now. He was working, always working, just not on what people thought. She paused, wiping a clean spot on the counter that was already clean. He used to say, a debt isn't always money. Some debts you pay with what you grow, with what you save. She fell silent then, as if she'd said too much. She just refilled Alara's mug and served her a bowl of thick stew that she didn't ask for and didn't charge her for. Alara ate, the warmth spreading through her, a fragile shield against the cold that was waiting for her down at the wharf. She learned more in that hour at Martha's counter than she had in years at the state home. She learned that a place is not just a building, but a story. And she learned that the man who had left her his failure might have been something else entirely. The story the town told about him was simple. The one Martha hinted at was not. As she left, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the diner. A man in a suit too expensive for this town stepped out. He had a polished smile and eyes that were constantly calculating. He saw Alara, saw the key she was holding, and his smile widened. He was heading straight for her. The man's name was Caldwell. He introduced himself with a handshake that was both firm and dismissive, his hand dry and cool. His suit was dark gray, perfectly pressed, and it seemed to absorb the light around him. He smelled of clean, expensive soap and ambition. I heard you'd arrived, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. I'm with a development firm. We've been interested in that parcel of land for some time. He gestured vaguely toward the docks, as if the cannery itself were too unpleasant to name directly. He looked at Alara, at her worn canvas bag and her thin jacket, and his smile became tinged with something like pity. It was a weapon. Frankly, he continued, lowering his voice into a confidential tone, that building is a liability. It's a miracle it hasn't collapsed. The town is going to tear it down, and when they do, they'll put a lien on the property for the cost of demolition. You'll end up with nothing. Worse than nothing. You'll end up with a bill. He let that sink in. He was a man accustomed to painting pictures of ruin for people, then offering them a small, tidy door out. I'm prepared to make you an offer. A charitable one, really, given the circumstances. $5,000. Cash. It would be a way for you to get a fresh start somewhere else. Away from all this, he waved a hand again, encompassing the faded town, the gray sea, the dying cannery. He was offering her an escape from her own inheritance. He saw a girl from an orphanage, alone and broke. He saw an easy transaction. He did not see the cool, smooth stone in her pocket. He did not see the stubborn set of her jaw, a thing she'd learned from years of having to hold on to what was hers when no one else would. "I'd like to see it first," she said. The words were quiet, but they were not uncertain. Caldwell's smile flickered for a fraction of a second. It was not the answer he expected. "Of course," he said, recovering smoothly. "But there's not much to see. Just rot and rust. Be careful in there. Wouldn't want you to get hurt." The threat was wrapped in politeness. A silken cord. He handed her a business card. The paper was thick and creamy. "The offer stands. For a few days. Don't take too long to decide." He got back into his car, and the engine purred to life, a sound alien to this place of sputtering boat motors and rattling pickups. The car pulled away, leaving only the scent of its exhaust and the weight of its owner's condescension hanging in the air. Alara walked down to the Cannery, the business card feeling flimsy and false in her hand compared to the solid, honest weight of the iron key. The front doors were chained and padlocked, but the deed had specified a side entrance, a small, low door near the back, half hidden by overgrown seagrass. The key was stiff in the lock. It hadn't been turned in years. She put her shoulder into it, using her whole body, and with a groan of protesting metal, the lock turned. The door swung inward into darkness. A wave of air washed over her, thick and heavy, a smell she had never encountered before but understood in her bones. It was the smell of cold, damp concrete, of brine soaked deep into wood, of rust, of engine oil, and beneath it all the faint, ghostly scent of fish, a memory trapped in the walls. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her, plunging her into a vast, echoing twilight. Her inheritance. She was finally home. The inside of the Cannery was a cathedral of decay. Light struggled through the grime on the high, arching windows, sending down dusty, golden shafts that illuminated floating motes of dust and rust. The air was still and cold, heavy with the silence of a place where loud work had once been done. A great cavernous room stretched out before her, filled with the skeletons of machinery. Conveyor belts snaked through the space like dried-out rivers, their rubber cracked and split. Vats big enough to hold a car stood silent, their stainless steel surfaces clouded with a film of grime. Everything was coated in a fine red powder of rust that seemed to puff into the air with every step she took. It was the color of dried blood. It was the color of giving up. She ran her hand along a railing, and a flake of rust and paint came away on her fingertips. It was a place of endings. She walked deeper into the building, her footsteps echoing in the immense space. She passed what must have been the main processing floor, then a series of smaller rooms. A locker room with metal doors hanging open like mouths, a small office with a desk buried under a drift of yellowed papers and collapsed plaster from the ceiling. A calendar on the wall was turned to a month 15 years ago. This was where time had stopped. In the far back corner of the main floor, hulking in the shadows, was the walk-in freezer. It was enormous, a riveted metal box that rose almost to the ceiling, its door thick and heavy, like a bank vault's. A patina of frost and corrosion covered its surface, and she could feel a deep, penetrating cold radiating from it, even though the compressors had been silent for more than a decade. It was a cold that felt older than weather, a permanent chill that had soaked into the very foundation of the building. And it was there, in the shadow of the great freezer, that she saw him. Akat. He was old, a tomcat with a torn ear and a coat the color of rust, a perfect match for his surroundings. He was sitting on the concrete floor, bolt upright, staring intently at the brick wall just behind the freezer. He didn't flinch as she approached, just turned his head slowly, his green eyes ancient and unblinking. He was not afraid. He was waiting. She sat down on an overturned crate a few feet away. She didn't try to touch him. She just sat, sharing the silence. The cat, after a moment, gave a slow blink, a sign of acceptance, and then returned his gaze to the wall. His presence was a small, stubborn spark of life in the overwhelming deadness of the place. He was the keeper of the ruin. She named him Rust. She spent hours in the Cannery that first day, just walking, touching things, breathing in the history of the place. She found a small workshop off the main floor, less decayed than the rest. Tools hung on a pegboard, outlined in dust. Wrenches, calipers, files, their shapes still clear. A pair of worn leather gloves lay on a workbench next to a half-disassembled motor, as if Silas had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute to finish his work. There was an order here, a care that was absent in the rest of the building. This was his sanctuary. It was here she began to feel him, not as a ghost, but as a presence, a careful intelligence that still lingered in the arrangement of the tools, in the neat coils of wire, in the very air of the small room. This was not the workshop of a man who had given up. This was the workshop of a man who had simply changed his work. As the sun began to set, sending long orange fingers of light through the grimy windows, she knew she would not be selling. She couldn't. It wouldn't be like selling a building. It would be like selling a grave. She didn't know what she was looking for or what she would do, but she knew she had to stay. She owed it to the man who had left his last testament to a stranger. As she left, locking the small door behind her, she saw Rust. He hadn't moved. He was still there, a small, loyal statue, keeping his silent vigil, watching the wall. The days took on a shape. In the mornings, Elara worked for Martha at the diner, washing dishes and bussing tables for a few dollars and all the food she could eat. Martha never called it a job. She just said, "You might as well make yourself useful while you figure things out." And she paid Elara from a cash box at the end of each day, her expression unreadable. In the afternoons, Elara would go to the cannery. She bought a broom and a bucket and work gloves. She started in the small workshop, sweeping away the years of dust and plaster, wiping down the tools, cleaning the grime from the single window until a clean, clear square of light fell across the workbench. It was a small act of reclamation, a single point of order in a universe of chaos. The town watched her. They saw her walking to the cannery each day with her bucket and her broom. They saw the faint glow of the lantern she worked by in the evenings. They whispered at the post office and in the aisles of the small grocery store. Pity was the main ingredient of their talk. "Poor girl," they'd say. "Doesn't have the sense to take the money and run. She's trying to sweep the ocean out of that place." Jeb, a former foreman from the cannery's last days, a man with a perpetually guilty slump to his shoulders, would sometimes watch her from the end of the pier, his face a mask of old shame. He never spoke to her. He just watched and then turned away. Caldwell's black car would cruise by every few days, a silent, predatory reminder of his offer. He never got out. He just slowed, looked, and drove on, confident that time and decay were on his side. But Elara wasn't trying to fix the whole building. She was just listening to it. And the more time she spent there, the more one thing pulled at her, a question that hummed just beneath the surface of the silence. It was the wall behind the giant freezer. Rust the cat was her compass. He never left it. He would sleep there, his body curled against the cold bricks. He would sit there for hours, a sentinel at his post. His devotion to that single, unremarkable stretch of wall was absolute. It was unnatural. One afternoon, she started to look at it closely. The rest of the cannery was built of old, dark, sea-stained brick, the mortar crumbling and sandy. But this section, the 20-foot span directly behind the freezer, was different. The bricks were a slightly different color, a harder, denser red. The mortar lines were cleaner, sharper, laid with a skill that was almost invisible. It was a patch, a massive, seamless patch, but a patch nonetheless. There was no reason for it. It wasn't an external wall. It led to nowhere, just the solid earth of the hillside the cannery was built against. Why would anyone rebuild an entire section of an interior wall with such precision, only to hide it behind a 2-ton freezer? She tried to move the freezer. It was an absurd, impossible task. It was bolted to the floor with massive iron bolts, rusted tight. She found a long iron pry bar in the workshop and wedged it underneath, putting all of her weight and strength into it. The bar bent. The freezer did not move. It gave a low, metallic groan, a sound of protest from its very core, but it did not budge a single inch. The effort left her breathless, her muscles aching, the frustration a hot knot in her stomach. Yet the failure only deepened the mystery. Whatever was behind that wall, Silas had not wanted it to be found by accident. The secret was sealed. For days, the wall became her obsession. She would run her hands over the bricks, feeling for any looseness, any change in temperature. She tapped each brick with a hammer, listening to the sound. Most gave a dull, solid thud. But near the bottom, right in the center, one brick gave a slightly different sound. A hollow echo, faint but unmistakable. A door. Not a door for a person, but an answer. A starting point. She sat on the floor, her back against the cold steel of the freezer, and looked at the cat. He was watching her, his green eyes glowing in the dim light. He seemed to be nodding, a silent confirmation. "You're getting warmer," he seemed to say. "You're finally starting to listen." The bolts holding the freezer to the floor were the key. They were thick as her thumb, their hexagonal heads fused by years of rust into shapeless, rounded lumps. She spent a day in the workshop, cleaning and sorting Silas's tools, learning their names and their functions from the faded diagrams in an old repair manual she found on a shelf. She found a can of penetrating oil still half full. For 3 days, she applied the oil to the bolts, letting it soak deep into the rusted threads, a patient, repetitive ritual. She would go to the cannery, tend to the bolts, and then sit with Rust, the two of them keeping their vigil in the growing quiet of the afternoon. On the 4th day, she found the wrench. It was huge, a monster of a tool, heavy and black, with an adjustable jaw that looked like it could crack stone. Took both hands to lift it. She fitted it over the first bolt head, the metal seating with a satisfying clank. She took a deep breath and pulled. Nothing. The bolt was one with the concrete. She repositioned her feet, braced herself against the freezer's metal wall, and pulled again, a low grunt escaping her lips. There was a sound. Not a movement, but a sound. A high, piercing screech of metal on metal. A sound of agony. The rust was breaking. Encouraged, she threw her entire weight into it, her muscles screaming in protest. The screech came again, louder this time, and then with a sudden jarring crack that echoed through the entire cannery, the bolt gave way, turned. Only a quarter of an inch, but it turned. It took her the rest of the day to loosen all 6 bolts. By the time she was done, her hands were raw, her body thrummed with exhaustion, and the floor around the freezer was littered with rust shavings and metal dust. But the beast was unchained. The next day, she brought the pry bar back. She wedged it under the front edge of the freezer and, this time, when she put her weight on it, the massive metal box scraped backward, moving an inch across the concrete floor with a deafening shriek. Then another inch. Then a foot. It was slow, brutal work. Each tiny movement was a victory. She worked until the sun went down, sweat stinging her eyes, her body a single, sustained ache. By the time she was done, she had moved the freezer 3 feet from the wall. It was enough. The space behind it was choked with thick, sticky cobwebs and the dust of ages. But the wall was clear, and the hollow-sounding brick was right where she had marked it. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She took a small chisel and a hammer from the workshop. With a few careful taps, the mortar around the brick crumbled. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The brick slid out of the wall as if it had been designed to do so, its edges perfectly smooth. Behind it was darkness. A cool, earthy smell, clean and damp, wafted out. A smell of living things, of soil and roots. It was utterly different from the dead, briny air of the cannery. She reached for the lantern. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part 1 have been waiting to tell you. It is the moment when a lock finds its key, when a question finds its answer, and when a girl who had been given nothing found the one thing she was meant to protect. She held the lantern up to the opening, her hand trembling slightly, and peered into the darkness. It was not a small cavity. It was a room, a hidden chamber, carved out of the earth and stone behind the cannery. And it was full. The lantern light cut a trembling circle in the darkness, revealing not treasure chests or stacks of money, but shelves. Rows upon rows of simple wooden shelves, reaching from the floor to the low, arched ceiling of the chamber. And on the shelves were jars. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Small glass jars, meticulously arranged, each with a small handwritten label. The light caught the glass, and the room sparkled with 1,000 tiny reflections, like a captured constellation. The air was cool and still, with that clean, earthy smell, like a cellar after a rain. A faint, almost inaudible hum vibrated through the floor, a low, steady thrum of life. Alara pulled out a few more bricks, widening the opening until she could squeeze through. She stepped inside, and the sound of the sea, the constant companion of the cannery, faded away, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. She walked down an aisle, holding the lantern high. The labels on the jars were written in a neat, concise script. They weren't filled with preserves or canned fish. They were filled with seeds. Seeds of every shape, size, and color. Tiny black specks, smooth ivory beads, wrinkled brown shells, vibrant red kernels. Each label bore a name and a year. Porter's Pride Tomato, 1988. Aunt Molly's Ground Cherry, 1992. King of the North Pepper, 1995. Blue Hubbard Squash, 2001. It was a library of life, a seed bank. At the back of the room, on a small wooden desk, sat a collection of thick, leather-bound ledgers. She opened the first one. The same neat script that was on the jars filled the pages. It was Silas's handwriting. For hours, she sat at that desk, the lantern her only light, and read. The ledgers were not just an inventory. They were a history, a secret history of the entire region. Silas had documented everything. He had spent the last 20 years of his life, the years the town thought he was rotting away in his failure, traveling the back roads, visiting small family farms, the ones being squeezed out by the same big companies that had killed his cannery. He had collected seeds from them, heirloom varieties that had been in their families for generations, plants perfectly adapted to the local soil and climate. He collected them just before the farms went under, just before the land was sold off and plowed under for vast, uniform fields of commercial hybrids. The ledger detailed the stories of the families, the flavors of the tomatoes, the resilience of the beans. It was a book of memories, and he hadn't just collected them, he had given them away. The back half of each ledger was a record of distributions. He had been secretly supplying a network of small, struggling farmers with these seeds, for free, giving them crops that were hardier, tastier, and more resistant to local blights than anything they could buy. He was single-handedly keeping a whole ecosystem of agriculture alive, a quiet, anonymous rebellion against a world that valued only profit and scale. The fortune behind the freezer wasn't money. It was life. It was possibility. It was a promise. The hum she felt was from a small, ingenious geothermal vent he had engineered, piping a steady, cool air current from deep within the earth to maintain the perfect temperature and humidity for the seeds. It was a work of quiet genius. As she turned a page in the first ledger, a sealed envelope fell out. On the front, in that same steady hand, were the words, "To the one who remembers what's worth keeping." Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short. It did not use her name. It began, "If you are reading this, then you have found my life's work. The state told me they would send someone who had nothing. I was that person once. I believe that a person with nothing is the only one who can understand the value of a seed. The land the cannery sits on is valuable. A man will come and offer you money for it. You can take the money. It will be enough to start a new life and no one would blame you. Or you can continue the work. These seeds are not a collection. They are a conversation. They need to be planted, grown, and shared or they will die. The choice is yours. I left you the lock. You found the key. What you do with the door is up to you, and at the bottom, a single sentence. A seed is a promise." Alara sat back, the letter resting in her lap, the weight of it immense. The choice was not a choice at all. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, what she had to do. The next morning, a notice was posted on the cannery door. It was from the town council, a final order of condemnation. The building was scheduled for demolition in 30 days. Caldwell had grown tired of waiting. The 30-day deadline was a death sentence, not just for the building, but for the living library hidden within it. Caldwell's impatience had turned into aggression. Alara knew she couldn't fight him on his terms. With lawyers and permits she didn't have. The ledgers were her only weapon. They contained not just the names of seeds, but the names of people, of families, of farms scattered across the coastal hills and inland valleys. She had a list. She spent the next 2 weeks on a borrowed bicycle from Martha, the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and strapped to the back. She pedaled down forgotten country roads, past fields of uniform, pale green crops that stretched to the horizon, the signature of large-scale agribusiness. She was looking for the smaller, messier places, the farms tucked away in hollows and on hillsides that the modern world had overlooked. At the first farm, a woman with a face as weathered as an old barn door met her with suspicion. Alara tried to explain, her words tumbling out, about Silas, the cannery, the seeds. The woman just shook her head. "Silas is dead," she said, her voice flat. "And we don't take charity." But then Alara opened the ledger. She pointed to a name. "It says here he got his Porter's Pride tomato seeds from your mother. In 1988, he wrote that they tasted like summer sunshine." The woman's hard expression cracked. A memory flickered in her eyes. "My mother's tomatoes," she whispered. "No one's grown those in 20 years. The seed companies told us they weren't profitable." Alara pulled a small glass jar from her bag. On the label it said Porter's Pride Tomato 1988. She held it out. The woman took the jar as if it were a holy relic. She stared at the small, pale seeds inside, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "He saved them," she said, her voice thick with wonder. "That stubborn old fool, he saved them." It was the same at every farm she visited. There was initial disbelief, then suspicion, and then, when she showed them the ledgers, when she produced the very seeds their grandmothers had planted, a slow, dawning wave of recognition and gratitude. These were not just seeds. They were their stories, their heritage, returned to them in small glass jars. They were people who had been told for years that their way of life was obsolete, that the things they valued were worthless. Silas had told them otherwise, in secret, and now this quiet girl was bringing the proof. They were not alone. She began to gather them. An old man who grew a purple pod bean his great-grandfather had brought from the old country. A young couple struggling to keep their small orchard of antique apple trees from being bulldozed for a housing development. A family whose sweet corn was so legendary people used to drive 50 miles to buy it, until a blight only the commercial hybrids were resistant to had wiped them out. Silas had saved a handful of their seed corn. One by one they saw what was at stake. It wasn't just a building. It was their past and their future. On the evening before the town council meeting, a dozen farmers gathered in the main room of the cannery, their faces illuminated by a string of work lights Alara had rigged up. They brought with them baskets and crates filled with the results of Silas's secret work. There were tomatoes of every color, red, yellow, purple, striped, twisted, beautiful carrots, peppers that glowed like jewels. The dead cannery was filled with the vibrant colors and smells of life. They were ready. Martha closed the diner early and came down, carrying a huge pot of chowder and a stack of bowls. Jeb, the former foreman, appeared at the door, his shoulders slumped even lower than usual, his face pale. He looked at the farmers, at the produce, at Alara. "I need to say something," he said, his voice raspy with shame. The town council meeting was held in a small, stuffy room with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered. The air smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Caldwell was there, sitting in the front row, looking confident and relaxed. He chatted with the council members like they were old friends, which most of them were. He saw Alara enter, followed by a procession of farmers in worn work clothes, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He saw it as a desperate, pathetic gesture. The meeting began. The condemnation of the cannery was the first item on the agenda. The council chairman, the same man who had been the dismissive town clerk, read the order in a flat monotone, citing safety violations, public nuisance, and vagrancy. He looked at Alara over the top of his glasses. "The council votes to approve the demolition order. Is there any reason we should not proceed?" Alara stood up. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried through the silent room. "Yes," she said. She did not talk about property rights or legal statutes. She talked about Silas. She told them the story she had found in the ledgers. The story of a man who had watched his town soul be sold off to the highest bidder and had decided to save what he could, seed by seed. Then she stepped aside. The farmers came forward one by one. They placed their baskets of vibrant, impossible produce on the council's table until it was overflowing with color and life. The first woman, the one with the weathered face, held up a brilliant red tomato. "This is Porter's pride," she said, her voice ringing with an old anger. "My mother grew it. Your agribusinesses, Mr. Caldwell, said it didn't ship well enough, wasn't uniform enough. You told us to plow it under. Silas saved it. This is not a weed. This is our history." An old man held up a handful of purple pod beans. "Your company, Mr. Caldwell, sold us seeds 1 year that were sterile. We couldn't save them for the next season. We had to buy from you again and again. You weren't selling seeds. You were selling dependence. Silas gave us these. These are freedom." On and on it went. A chorus of voices, telling the same story of loss and quiet rescue. They were not just defending a building. They were reclaiming their own dignity. Caldwell's polished smile had vanished. His face was a tight mask of fury. He stood up, interrupting. "This is a farce. A sentimental sideshow. We are talking about a dangerous, derelict building. This has nothing to do with vegetables." And then Jeb, the foreman, stood up from the back of the room. Every eye turned to him. His face was ashen. "It has everything to do with it," he said, his voice cracking. 15 years ago, Mr. Caldwell's company wanted to buy the cannery. Silas wouldn't sell. He was trying to retool to local produce. He was going to compete with them. Jeb took a ragged breath. "Caldwell paid me. He paid me to sabotage the main boiler, to make it look like an accident. I ruined that equipment. I'm the one who shut the cannery down. I'm the one who broke that old man's heart." A collective gasp went through the room. The confession hung in the air, irrefutable and devastating. Caldwell was speechless, his face pale. The town council members looked at him, then at the farmers, then at the bounty on their table. They were no longer looking at a derelict building. They were looking at the evidence of their own neglect, their own willingness to let a good man be erased. The chairman cleared his throat. He looked at the condemnation order in his hands as if it were contaminated. Without a word, he tore it in half. The room was silent for a moment, and then it erupted in applause. Elara looked at the faces of the farmers, proud and vindicated. She looked at Jeb, weeping silently in the back. She looked at the torn paper on the floor. It was over. The cannery was safe. The aftermath of the meeting was quiet but decisive. Caldwell left town that night, his black car disappearing down the coastal highway without a backward glance. His development plans and his reputation were in ruins. The town, awakened from a long slumber of indifference, began to stir. The story of Silas's secret library, his quiet, decades-long act of defiant preservation, spread from the diner to the post office to the fishing boats in the harbor. It became a local legend overnight. Shame was a powerful motivator. People who had once pitted Elara or dismissed Silas as a crazy old man now looked at the cannery with something like reverence. It was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a testament to a value system they had forgotten they shared. The morning after the meeting, Jeb was waiting for her at the cannery door. His eyes were red, but his shoulders were, for the first time, straight. "I can't fix what I broke," he said, his voice low. "Not for Silas. But I can work. I know every pipe, every wire, every machine in this place. Let me help you make it right. I don't want pay." Elara just nodded. A debt isn't always money. Some debts you pay with what you do next. He was the first. Martha was the second. She started a cannery fund jar on the diner counter. By the end of the week, it was overflowing with crumpled bills and loose change. It wasn't much money, but it was a start. Then others began to arrive. An old electrician came by and spent a day rewiring the workshop, getting the lights to work safely. A retired carpenter showed up with a truck full of salvaged lumber and began reinforcing the sagging roof supports. A group of fishermen, their day's haul done, came and replaced the shattered windows, their movements sure and practiced. They worked without being asked, their labor a form of apology, a communal act of atonement. The cannery began to breathe again. The cavernous main room, once a tomb for dead machinery, was cleaned and cleared. The farmers, now part of a newly formed co-op, brought in tables and scales. They set up a small, year-round market where they could sell the produce grown from Silas's seeds directly to the townspeople, cutting out the middlemen who had strangled them for so long. The hidden chamber was opened up, a proper door installed. It became the heart of the new operation, the Silas Reed Community Seed Bank. Elara, with the help of the farmers, learned the intricate art of seed saving, the drying, the sorting, the cataloging. She spent her days in the quiet, earthy-smelling room, her hands full of future harvests. She wasn't the owner anymore. She was the custodian, the librarian of a living collection. She did not sign the papers that would have made her wealthy. She did not take the offers that came from universities and agricultural foundations who, having heard the story, wanted to buy the collection. She knew the seeds did not belong in a sterile lab. They belonged here in the soil they were born from, in the hands of the people who knew their stories. The building was not restored to its former glory. It remained a patched-together, salt-scoured place, but it was alive. It was filled with the sounds of work again, not the roar of machines, but the murmur of conversation, the laughter of children helping to sort beans, the quiet rustle of seeds being poured into envelopes. The cannery had found a new purpose, or perhaps had finally fulfilled its old one, to feed the community, not just with fish, but with hope. One cool autumn afternoon, a year after she had arrived, Elara was at the old workbench in the workshop, carefully packing seeds into small paper packets. Rust, now sleek and content, was asleep in a patch of sun on the floor. A battered pickup truck, unfamiliar to her, pulled up outside. A young couple got out, looking hesitant and worn down by worry. They approached the door and peered inside. "Excuse me," the man said. "We heard a story in town about this place. About seeds their farm," they explained, "was failing. They had bought into the promise of the big seed companies, and now they were drowning in debt, their soil depleted. They had heard there was another way." Elara listened, her expression calm and patient. She had heard this story before. She did not say much. She simply wiped her hands on her apron, went into the seed bank, and came back with a small plain glass jar filled with tiny, dark seeds. She placed it in the woman's hands. The woman looked down at the jar, then up at Elara, her eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. "What is it?" she asked. Elara looked at the jar, then at the couple. "It's a promise," she said quietly. "A promise that something small, something overlooked, something the world has deemed worthless, can hold the whole world inside it, waiting for the right hands, the right soil, the right time to grow."
Sidui lives here. Does anyone live over here? Bonsley. Honestly, not gonna lie, low-key forgot about Bonsley living here. Ooh, this might be good. Ooh, okay, I'm down for some flooring recipes. Did you know you can use honey to summon them to your home? I did, Lucifer. I found that out because I needed to talk to Scyther and he was gone. I was like, WTF. I just learned that. I was so mad. let's do... more moss beds, a lantern, and stalagmites. No, stalactites. No, mites. They're mites. Okay. I think I'm gonna swing by. Where do I have electric types? Skylands? Yeah. Okay, so I'm awake. Hi, Summer. Okay, let's see if any Pokemon have moved in. I think Ninetales is here. Perfect. But I also really need Raichu to come with us.